Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Corning Museum of Glass, to our live stream flameworking demo. My name's Caitlin Hyde. Does this sound all right? It's echoing for me, but it sounds okay. Okay, so my name's Caitlin Hyde. I am so delighted and honored to be here to do this live stream demo today. I have a lot of things I want to show you and tell you about, and so thank you for being here so that I can do that. I am a lifetime maker of things. I love to make things. I have as long as I can remember. I love to make things out of lots and lots of different materials. I work with glass. I have been working with glass for about 30 years, and so I make a lot of things out of glass, and that's what we're going to be focusing on mostly today, is the flame-worked glass process. So I love glass because it is beautiful, the process is challenging, it's fascinating, there's an endless potential to learn new things. I've been working with glass 30 years, but haven't begun to run out of interesting things to learn about it yet. So I love glass, but I also love a lot of other materials. And so one of my sort of long-term quests has been figuring out how to combine flame-worked glass objects with other materials to make interesting and more complex sculptures. So I'm going to be talking about that a little bit today too. I've got a lot of examples here of things that I want to show you. So here at the museum, my job is flamework demonstrating. I'm a flamework demonstrator. I've been here for about 15 years doing that, and that happens upstairs in the flameworking booth in the museum. And those demos have a particular kind of format, which is they have a sort of short time frame, maybe 20 minutes or so. And in that demo, I typically will make a little glass animal, and I'll make it from beginning to end and explain all the steps of the process to the visitors. And it happens very efficiently, and I can cover a lot of really interesting information about glass, about how to shape glass, the material properties of glass, the technique, and end up making a very pretty little object. And so it's a really nice kind of demo because I can do a lot of teaching and explaining at the same time as I'm making something out of glass. And so I have a lot of experience, about 15 years of experience now, making glass objects that take 15 minutes to make. So that's a particular type of thing that's lovely to be able to do. But in my personal work, and when I'm working on my personal artwork, what I really love is making things that are much more complex, that are larger, that take more time, more precision, more detail. And when I'm doing that kind of work, it really takes my full attention in order to do that. In the regular flameworking demos, the reason I can talk so much and explain so much is that I make relatively simple designs, and I've made them many, many, many times before. And so I can split my focus and be able to, do the flameworking almost on autopilot, and then do a lot of talking and explaining as well. That's a great thing to be able to do, and I want to share some of that with you today, but I also really want to show you some more complex flameworking, and so here's my plan. We have about an hour and a half for this demo, and so what I'm going to do is start with a little demonstration that will be of the scale that I typically would do in the flameworking booth upstairs. I can show you the steps of the process, I can explain it all to you, and we'll make a nice little decorative object, and then a little bit later I'll make something that's more complex, that takes longer, and when I'm doing that I won't be able to explain as much of it, but you will already know what I'm doing because you will have watched the first project, and so you'll have more of a sense of where to look to see what's happening with the glass, and you'll understand why I'm doing what I'm doing and how and why the glass is doing what it's doing. So I want to divide this into two parts, a little short one to start with, a longer one toward the end, and then in between that I have a whole bunch of show and tell as well, so I want to be able to talk to you about that too. And so thank you for being here. Let's start with the flame work. And I'm going to switch my glasses here. And I'm going to make a little sculpture of a mushroom, just a little cute mushroom. And I'm starting with my torch. Flameworking is a technique where we start with the glass at room temperature. We only melt the amount of glass that we need for each step of the process. And I'm going to be working with solid glass rods to start with here. And this is about a 4,000 degree flame. 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, that's a high temperature. So to produce that much heat, the torch is burning natural gas. That's like you'd have for a gas stove. That by itself isn't really hot enough to melt glass very efficiently, though. And so we also add a lot of compressed oxygen to the flame. And I bet this will sound familiar. Oxygen is an accelerant for flame, right? It means it makes it burn hotter. And so that's how we get that really high temperature. And one of the other really useful things that the oxygen is doing here is to push the heat away from me. It's a very directional flame. That means there's really not that much heat coming off the sides of that flame. So see how close I can put my hand to that? Not because my hands are super tough, but because there really isn't that much heat coming off the side of it. It's almost all moving away from me. So that explains how I can work so close to the flame. It also means that I can be very specific about which parts of the glass will get soft. The glass has to be directly in the flame in order to soften. The part that's next to the flame, it's hot, very hot, but not hot enough that it softens. And so you'll see that the glass rod holds its shape even though I'm melting the end of it. And so this is, really a key characteristic of glass that allows this process to work. This is a piece of white glass I'm starting with, by the way. And so I've been heating it and melting the glass, and you see it is forming a kind of a round shape. We call that a gather. This is going to be the cap of the mushroom eventually. When I gather that glass up, it's very soft once it is heated and it's flowed into that round shape. And right now, as it's cooling, it's getting hard on the surface, but the inside is still really soft. And what I'm going to do next is roll the top of this bit of glass in a little bowl of crushed up brown glass. We call that frit. Frit is the crushed up glass, and the color of it is brown. And that's going to make a nice little sort of speckled color effect on the top of the mushroom. But I can't put that into the bowl of frit while it's soft on the inside, because if I do and push that in, it'll squish the gather. So while I've been talking to you, I have been waiting for the glass to firm up. And then I'm going to heat it again. Heating and cooling, alternating the heating and cooling of the glass to get different parts softer or harder at different moments is an important part of the shaping process too. And so remember, that's a very intensely hot flame, so I can heat the surface of that glass really quickly, and then that allows me to stick it into the bowl of frit and gather that up, almost like sugar or sprinkles on ice cream. And then we're going to melt that brown frit into the surface. To melt it in, I'm getting the gather soft again. And I want to put another layer of frit on there just to give it a little bit more of an intense color. And that means that once I've melted in the first layer, I have to wait again. So waiting is hard. Waiting is hard to do. And when you're first learning to work with glass, that's one of the hardest things to learn, is when do you heat the glass and when do you wait for it to cool? And so your instinct is often to heat it because that seems, very important and dramatic. It is important to heat the glass, but waiting for it to be firm is equally important. And over time, you learn when is the right moment to do which of those things. So we're going to melt that in. And then we'll start shaping the mushroom cap. So with flame work, we start with the glass at room temperature. We're only heating the glass that we're using for each step of the process. And the glass that I'm using today is called borosilicate. There are many different types of glass, and borosilicate has some different ingredients in its formula than other formulas of glass. Borosilicate is what we call a hard glass, and that means it is actually harder at room temperature than some other types of glass. It also has a higher viscosity. Viscosity is how sticky or stretchy the glass is. And so that's one of the reasons I like it for this type of project, because you're going to see that I'm sculpting solid glass here. That means I'm pushing and pulling on the glass quite a lot in order to shape it. And having a glass that's kind of firm when you melt it is nice for this type of project. So again, I'm heating part of that gather and then rolling it and pressing it on this pad. This is made of graphite. Graphite's a nice material for shaping glass because it's pretty insulative. It doesn't conduct heat very well, which means it's not going to pull the heat out of the glass as fast as a metal surface would. I can shape glass on a metal surface too, but the metal's going to draw heat out of the glass faster, and so it will tend to not only chill the glass, but also create friction. As the metal heats up, it starts to want to sort of grab the glass. There are times when you want to use a metal tool with your glass because you want friction, you want to be able to really move it around firmly, but the graphite, because it's not pulling as much heat out, remains more slippery to the glass, so it has a little bit more delicate interaction with the glass. So we've got just a little cone shape now that has brown speckles on it, and I'm going to put a handle on the top of that so that I can melt the glass rod off the bottom. And actually, I need to move this pad out of the way here. That's better. It's a nice cushiony pad, but it was making me feel a little too tall in relation to the torch. Okay, so I'm going to put a temporary handle on the top there. Now, what we've got looks kind of like a mushroom already. The white glass that's sticking out underneath looks kind of like a stem. And so my first instinct might be just to melt that handle off and call it a mushroom. But it doesn't really look quite the way I want it to yet. And so I'm going to hold this upside down to the camera here. Right here, what would be the bottom part of the mushroom cap is sort of plump. It has sort of a curve to it, and what I really want is for it to be flat. I want it to have a nice 90-degree interface with the stem. And so it seems a little counterintuitive, but what I'm first going to do is take that handle off of there, reshape the bottom of the mushroom cap, and then using this same piece of glass, I'm going to reattach it to make the stem. This kind of detail work and attention to detail and meticulousness is what I particularly love about flame working, because that, for me, in all the work that I've ever done, in all the creative work that I've ever done, I've always been passionate about delicate fine-tuning. And so there are many different methods for shaping glass, but this is the one that works for me because I can work so close up with the glass and spend an endless amount of time perfecting the details. So that's what makes me very happy. Okay, we've got a flat surface on the bottom of the mushroom cap, a handle attached to the top of the mushroom cap, and then I'm going to join these parts and then shape the stem. Heat doesn't travel through glass very fast. I bet you guessed that already just watching this. So even though that connection point between the stem and the cap is 3,000 degrees right now, the heat is moving so slowly through that glass that there's actually plenty of surface area right there between the hot glass and my hand for the heat to just keep escaping into the air before it ever gets to me. Even if I'm heating it for a long time, the part that I'm holding is going to stay room temperature. And I know that seems kind of surprising if you're not familiar with it, but it's actually a natural characteristic of glass. And you can see how that's what's allowing this process to work. And it means This is a technique where I can get very close up with molten glass, and so it does lend itself to doing really delicate detail work. Now the heat's traveling that way, but of course gravity is pulling the molten glass toward the table. And so I've been just now shaping the stem by tilting that glass rod and letting it stretch a little bit. And so we have a nice little kind of teardrop shape at the bottom, and then the stem and the mushroom cap. So that's a little cute mushroom, right? It's sort of finished. But one of the things that I need to think about when I'm making something out of glass is that once I've shaped it, how does it exist in the world? And so we've got this little teardrop shape at the bottom, and that means if I take the handle off and put this down on the table, it's going to fall over. It's not going to stand. And so what do I want this mushroom to do? Do I want it to stand, in which case I need to work out some kind of system for it to be able to balance? Do I want to make it into a little pendant that I could wear maybe, in which case I would shape a loop to hang it from on the top? Or what I am going to do, because I already know the answer to these questions that I'm asking, but what I am going to do is join it with some other mushrooms and make a little mushroom cluster. So rather than make you watch me shape 2 more mushrooms, I prepared them ahead of time. So we've got 2 more mushrooms here that are already attached to each other. And then I'm going to attach the 3rd mushroom to that grouping, and then I'll shape the bottom so that it has some little feet so it can stand. So this is an example of something that is really important to me in my work, which is that I really like working small and developing details and shaping very carefully. And then I like to take those smaller objects and combine them to make something that's more complicated, more interesting. And so I often am thinking in terms of modules, small parts that may or may not have the same kind of shape to them, but that can be then assembled into something that becomes more interesting because of the repetition of the shapes and the parts. There's a little bit of clear glass left there from the handle, so I'm just cleaning that off and then shaping up the top of this mushroom. Now, I'm going to need to melt the bottom of that little structure in order to shape the feet so that it will balance. And when I do that, the mushrooms are going to can get soft, and the connections between them can start to sort of flop around. So what I have to do is come at that very delicately, making sure that I'm only heating one portion of the glass at a time. And that's where the directionality of the flame really comes into play, because you'll see that I'm coming up to the side of the flame and just dipping the edge of that glass into the flame so that I can heat just the tiniest little portion of that mushroom stem. And everything else stays out of the flame, and so it holds its shape. And so I'm making a little kind of tripod here by extending each one of those mushroom stems just a little point at a time so that it'll be like a little 3-legged stool, a 3-legged toadstool. And then I can adjust that a little bit so that it should be able to balance. I think it will balance. It's hard to tell when the handle's still attached to the top, but I'll take that off and then we'll be able to see a little bit more clearly. And so I'm working with different parts of the glass at different temperatures in order to get the glass to behave in very different ways. So you can see just from this simple process that sometimes the glass is very soft, in which case I can move it around and shape it. Sometimes it's quite hard, so it holds its shape, and sometimes it's sort of in between there. And so knowing how to coax it into those situations where it will move the way that I want it to for my shaping is really the key to being able to get the shapes that I want and get the kind of precision that I want. Just cleaning off the end of that glass rod. Okay, so we made a little group of mushrooms, and now you know everything about flame working. And so I'm going to tell you some more things about my art making process, and then we'll come back and do some more flame working. But I wanted to just go through those steps so you have an idea of what's going on with the glass. And so next thing I want to do is talk to you a little bit about sort of my history of making things and how and why I do what I do. And so I have some show and tell items to share with you here. I mentioned at the beginning that I have been a maker of things for my whole life, and I was thinking when I was preparing for this demo about, you know, how is it that I make what I make, and where does that come from? When I have taught workshops, often there will be students who are worrying and wondering, how do I develop my style? And what I've always been smart enough to tell them is, you already have a style, but we can help you figure out what it is. And so we do lots of exercises with, you know, collecting imagery and sketching and putting parts together and thinking about, you know, the things that appeal to us. And then as a student, you can start looking at that and going, oh, I see, I do know what I like, and so that all adds up to what my style might be, and it's going to be different from what somebody else does. And so I started looking around at the things that I've made in the last year and the things that I've made in previous years, and then I found something that I made a really, really long time ago. And so I'll start with this. This is a little wooden doll, a little puppet sort of doll, and it's carved out of twigs, and I made that when I was 12. So it's an antique now. And so I remember making this, and I remember that I was very proud that I was allowed to have a pocket knife. And because I had always, you know, in years before that, my parents were very supportive of creative work, but I had always only made drawings or soft things out of fabric, dresses. I could paint, I could draw, I could make things out of cloth. But when I was allowed to have a knife, suddenly that seemed like a really important thing, because then I could shape something that was hard. And so this is a little carved doll. When I was a kid, I didn't play with dolls. I didn't have any interest in playing with dolls, but I liked the idea of making a doll, and particularly one that had articulated parts, something that could be attached and something that would have some movement to it. And so that is the oldest thing that I own that I made. And so I'm going to show you as we go along how the things that I make now, without me ever planning this or doing it on purpose, there are things that I make now that are awfully similar to that, even though now I'm making them out of glass. And now I have all kinds of tools and equipment, and I work with lots of different hard materials and dangerous things like fire. So, and I also still have some pocket knives that I can use as well. So that's a very old piece of carved wood. The idea of being able to attach those parts by way of wires that go through holes. There's holes in the body of the doll, holes in the arms and the legs, and so those parts are attached by wires. Sort of speaks to the fact that I've always been interested in trying to figure out how to put parts together. And when I'm working with glass, glass is a beautiful and very hard and slippery material, and it's not absorbent. And so it's a really challenging material to try to attach to other things, because there's not much that you can do with glue. These days there actually are a lot of kinds of adhesive that artists work with glass. But when I first started working with glass 30 years ago, there weren't as many kinds of adhesives that would work with glass, and so I always just kind of shied away from that idea, and I always wanted to think about how might I put parts together where it didn't rely on glue, which could eventually, I assumed, break apart. I think now there are glass adhesives that are stronger than the glass itself, so that's not necessarily a limitation now, but my thought process was always about how to put parts together in other ways. And so here's a little devil, a little sort of puppet made of glass, but you can see it's assembled in the same way as that little wooden doll that I made many, many years ago. And this is something that that I was working on a few years ago, just before COVID. So there were a lot of projects that I was in the middle of just before COVID, and then, you know, we all went into quarantine and things changed a lot. And so there are a lot of ideas and processes that I'm still in the middle of, but haven't quite gotten around to working on again since then. But eventually I will. And it's interesting for me to look at that and go, oh, of course I'll come back to that, because it's what I've always done, right? I've always been interested in making figurative work and assembling parts and figuring out interesting ways to put them together. In my early years as a flame worker, I was a bead maker. I specifically made glass beads and jewelry, and I still do that. And a bead, of course, by definition, is an object with a hole in it. And so glass beads you can make using the flame working technique, and they have holes in them, which means that that's automatically a nice opportunity to be able to attach it to something else. And a piece of jewelry is often assembled by way of wires or strings or stitching. And so this is a little, oh, I'm holding it to the camera, sorry. This is a textile and glass bead amulet that I made for my kitchen during the first month of the COVID quarantine. It's a protective amulet because, you know, of course, that was a period of time where we all were wondering what on earth is going on and how scared do I need to be. And so this was something that I worked on for fun, making use of a lot of different techniques that I love. So there's some knitted fabric in here, there's some felt, there's some glass beads, there's some stitching, and the whole thing is mounted on a cardboard structure, and so I was using bookbinding techniques to put that together. So that was for my amusement, and also as sort of a maintaining of my skills. I said that I have been making things my whole life, and it is a joyful part of my life, and also it's a little bit of a compulsion, and so a happy compulsion. But I spend an awful lot of time making things and thinking about making things, and so having time to fill during the quarantine led me to do what I'm most comfortable doing, which is make something that's very meticulous and takes many, many hours to do. So in my quest to figure out how to put parts together, I have often thought about making glass parts with holes in them so that they can be stitched together. This is a little figurine that I made probably 15 years ago, and these parts are actually beads. So they're stacked on a wire that goes through the center of them and then held together with epoxy. So I was actually experimenting with some adhesives there, but they're mounted on that metal wire, and then the base is wood. And so that's a fairly early example of how I was thinking about how to use glass, make delicately detailed parts, put them together in a modular way, and work with other materials, and then make something that's larger than any of the individual beads could be. So lots of little characters and figurines, and then here's a little bit more recent example of glass mounted in wood, so that this now becomes a wall-hanging piece of sculpture. And it also has paper on the surface of it, which means that gives me a flat surface upon which I can paint or draw. And so the glass, the grapes, and this glass element here, which is kind of like a wine glass stem, has two prongs here that fit down into the wood block, and that holds everything together. It also means that I could do some pretty delicate glass work, but also feel confident that that glass was fairly protected. It's not going to be sitting on a table where it might tip over, but instead it's mounted on a nice solid piece of wood, and so you can actually move this around and not worry about knocking it over and breaking it. And that's, as a glass artist, that's my fear always, is that if I make something and somebody wants it and they have it and they love it, what happens when they break it? Because glass breaks, right? And I don't know how to fix it, because when glass is broken, you really can't fix it. So I'm always thinking about, how am I going to make this beautiful and amazing and not breakable? So that's part of that puzzle solving as well. Okay, so that's the beginning. I'll show you one more thing here. So this is a piece that's not finished, but I wanted to show you this structure because this is a wooden box, and I've kind of built a little rig on the inside of it and drilled holes in the top and through that rig so that a piece of, this is not all glass, but parts of it are glass, so that a glass object could be built that would slide down into that hole and be supported by the rig inside and have more volume, and again have flat surfaces where I could potentially put drawing or painting, and then have that combination of materials and techniques in a larger structure. So that's kind of the history of my thinking about how to work with different materials and different parts. And then I want to show you some more flame working. I'm going to make something a little bit more complicated next. If you have questions as we go along, you are absolutely welcome to call out to me. You'll need to speak kind of loudly so I can hear you. But I'm very happy to answer questions if I can. And if I can't, I will let you know at the time whether I can or not. Okay. I'm going to make a mushroom. I already made a mushroom, but I'm going to make a larger mushroom. And this one's going to be much sillier because it's going to be a little mushroom cartoon character. Starting out again, same thing. We've got a nice hot flame. This is a piece of glass tubing. And so in this situation, I'm going to blow glass. I'm going to make a bubble. The glass tubing, I've already prepared this a little bit because there's some steps of the process that are kind of slow, and I wanted to just get a little bit ahead so I can start on the sculpting part of it. But this started out like this. This is a piece of manufactured glass tubing. It's white glass. It's, when we get the tubes, they're about 1 meter long, and then we can use segments of them to work with. When you're blowing glass at the torch, you're starting with tubing. And this piece of tubing, I heated and stretched. You see it has a very narrow kind of handle there. This is called a point. And so this segment is the size of the original tube. The rest of it is stretched out nice and thin. It's still hollow all the way through, closed off on the end here. And so what we've got now is a handle for me to hold the tubing with and a blowpipe. This is one of the things I love so much about flame working is the glass is the whole deal. It's what you're holding. It's what you're moving your glass around with. It's your blowpipe. It's your paintbrush. And so you're having this amazingly intimate and direct interaction with the material as you're working. And you don't end up needing a whole lot of other equipment because you're relying so much on your interaction with the glass and the behavior of the glass itself. So for anybody who's a glass worker and is curious about some of the specifics of the glass that I'm using, I mentioned earlier that this is all borosilicate glass that I'm working with. This particular white glass that I'm using is Chinese white, and the name of the color is jade white. It is a color of glass that I really like working with. I use it a lot because when you melt it, it flows fairly smoothly. And it is translucent. So in a thick rod, it's going to be quite bright white looking, but in thinner applications, it starts to become transparent. And so I use it a lot in combination with the clear borosilicate because it's very pretty, because you have this range of glass that is either clear or translucent or looks a little bit like it's been frosted, or sometimes a nice clean hard area of white. I'm heating half of this piece of tubing to get it soft, and then I'm going to inflate it a little bit. Blowing glass is an interesting term that people use in different ways. And so a lot of people will say glass blowing for any process where you're melting glass and shaping it. I'm a little more particular about how I use the term glass blowing because it seems to me more logical to use that for when you're actually blowing air into it, because that's really what it means. And so here I'm flame working and I am blowing glass at the torch. Earlier when I made that other little set of mushrooms, I was sculpting glass at the torch, but I wouldn't necessarily call that blowing glass because I didn't blow into it. But as I say, lots of people use that a little differently than I do. So I'm just this end is going to be the bottom of the mushroom stem. And so I'm just puffing into it a little bit to plump it up. And then we're going to add some legs. And you'll see throughout this process, even though now I'm blowing glass instead of just sculpting solid glass, I'm going to be doing the same things that I was doing in that first little demo, where I'm working with different parts at different temperatures, and really relying on the movement of the glass to get the shapes that I want. So this is a solid rod of glass, and I'm going to melt some of that and attach it to make a leg. When you melt glass, I mentioned earlier that it tends to form round shapes and curved shapes, and structurally, glass is a lot more stable when you connect parts by curved transitions, by gradations of thickness. If you stick a bit of glass at a 90-degree angle onto another bit of glass and you get a very crisp angle or a sort of sharp geometric shape, that's kind of a recipe for the glass breaking. It's going to be a fragile connection for glass. And if you think about when I was putting the stems on the mushrooms, you might think, but hey, wait a minute, you did that on the base of the mushroom. But what I actually did was I made it look like it was a sharp angle, but as I was attaching that bit of glass for the stem of the mushroom, I stretched it a little bit. So because I really like kind of geometric angular shapes, I've put a lot of attention over time into how to trick the glass, how to make it look like one thing, but actually in terms of the structure of the glass be something else. And so the reason I'm telling you all of that is to explain what I'm doing here as I'm attaching the legs. So this glass in the tube has a wall thickness of maybe 1/8 of an inch or so. And if I stick the solid glass gather onto it to make the leg and just push it on there and melt it together, there's going to be a point there that is going to be kind of fragile. It's not going to be very comfortable for the glass at that connection point. But if you can kind of like imagine in your mind what's happening inside the tube when I do this, I'm heating a little spot there and then I'm inflating it a bit. So right where I puffed that glass out, it's now become a little bit thinner there. And so when I attach this thicker bit of glass and then stretch it a little bit, I'm creating a gradation of thickness to connect the leg to the bubble. All of that is something you won't ever see in the glass, but it's something that you learn about by having a lot of pieces of glass that you make break. So glass has a tendency to break when you're working with it in different ways, and it teaches you what it's willing to tolerate and what it's not willing to tolerate. And so by repeating steps over and over again, you eventually can get a pretty good instinct about what the glass is going to allow you to do. This is called flashing the glass. I'm rotating it in the flame very rapidly, and because I don't want any of those parts to melt, I'm just soaking heat into the glass to warm it up and even out its temperature. An interesting thing to know about glass is that when you heat it, it swells, and when you cool it, it shrinks. And if you heat or cool it too rapidly or too unevenly, it will swell and shrink unevenly, and it will tug against itself. At the atomic level, you'll have different parts that are sort of pushing and pulling, and that creates what we call thermal stress. And if you allow too much thermal stress to build up in your glass, it can tug itself apart. In other words, it breaks. And so as I'm shaping this little mushroom character, I need to be attentive to that. I need to have a sense of how much temperature variation can it withstand without breaking. And so when I'm working on a little foot, right now I'm kind of going back and forth from one leg to the other to match up the size of those feet. So when I'm focusing my attention and the heat on those feet, that means the rest of it's out of the flame. It's getting cool pretty quickly. And if it gets too cool, and then I go back and reheat it, that will shock the glass. And so throughout this process, in between every step of the shaping, you're going to see me doing this. So that's called flashing the glass, and that's to just keep heat soaked into it so it stays warm and is less likely to break. Okay, this little mushroom is going to be sitting. So we got 2 legs, and then I'm going to shape the feet and adjust the back side of it so that it can balance. And again, just trying to create a nice sort of smooth transition there from the hollow part of the glass to that solid bit that I've added. That's going to be like a little, sort of like a little penguin tail there that will help this to be stable. Okay, so it's important at this point in the process that I create a stable footing for this sculpture, because I'm just about to take the handle off the top, and so that I can shape the top part of it. And that means that from the time I put the new handle on there until the end, I won't be able to make any more adjustments to the bottom. Throughout this process, there are going to be moments when I need to puff some air into the glass. And this bit of tubing is what I'm getting ready to remove it. And so in order to continue to be able to puff air into it, what I need to do is make a little hole here at the bottom. And then the handle that I'm going to attach is also going to be a tube. So I'm kind of switching the angle of my blowpipe. This mushroom design is something that I've been working on throughout the summer. And I was telling you that I really like meticulous work, and I really am interested in fine-tuning details. And the way that I can manage to do the kind of precision work that I want is by making something over many, 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 many times. And so I probably have made 15 of these mushroom characters so far. I haven't gotten to the point where I'm quite satisfied with them yet, but it might take 100 of them before I think that I'm satisfied with them. And that's part of the pleasure of it for me, is continuing to think about, well, how could I make this better, or how might I make it more like what I imagined? Or in that process of repeating the steps over and over again, something might be revealed to me by the process, by the glass, that would lead me to make some variation of it that I would never have thought of if I wasn't making it over a bunch of times. And so I've made this mushroom a number of times. I'm not 100% confident about it yet. And so there's always the potential that I will crack the glass, or that it will fall off of the handle, or that it will, something can go wrong. But that's also part of what keeps glass work exciting, is that anytime you light the torch and start melting some glass, you got all kinds of opportunity to fail. And so it's a good teacher. It teaches you to be humble and to give, and to keep wanting to need to know it. but for glassmakers, a lot of times it's interesting to know the specifics of a glass and why it's doing what it does. All right, this is another great example of working with different parts at different temperatures. I need the mushroom stem to be hot, but not soft. I need the red glass to be very, very soft, and I want to have the white glass just under the flame. So it's not going to get soft, but I can apply that red glass almost like a stroke of very thick paint. This takes practice to be able to do this. If you're off of your placement by a 1/16 of an inch or so, you can end up with the glass underneath getting too soft, and you end up sort of pushing it out of shape. If you can end up with the glass that you're applying to the surface not being soft enough to really flow onto the glass below it, you can trap air. There's lots of ways that I can ruin this. I'm going to try not to, though. So it takes a lot of practice to be able to do this, because you have to have everything in just the right place, and you have to learn to do that by feel. I'm pushing against the glass and feeling as it softens and flows. But it's taking advantage of the natural behavior of the glass in, I think, a very lovely way. So I'm going to melt that in. Now, you might wonder, well, why is that red glass not red? And so let me tell you a little bit about color in glass. And let me start by telling you about how glass is made. So glass, I mentioned earlier, there's lots of different formulas of glass, and they have different characteristics depending on the mineral ingredients in the formulas. And if you're a glass manufacturer, you're generally going to start with silica as your main ingredient. Silica comes from sandstone, and silica is the second most common element in the Earth's crust. So there's a lot of it. If you just melt silica by itself, it melts at a very high temperature, around 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's not necessarily going to flow very nicely. It's not necessarily going to look the way you want it to, or be very workable. But one of the things that people have discovered over thousands of years of making glass is that if you add some other ingredients, one of them is soda ash, that's another mineral. If you add that to your silica and melt those together, the soda ash works as what's called a flux. It lowers the melting temperature of the glass and makes it flow more smoothly. All right, so I'm just rounding out the part that's red and a little bit of the white that's below it. I know you can't see that color difference, but that's why I'm explaining it too, because when I shape the mushroom cap, we're going to get that red part to kind of drop down over the white part. So if you melt silica and soda ash together, you get a glass that melts at a lower temperature and it flows nice and smoothly, but it's not always completely stable. If you just have the soda ash in there, you can end up with glass that starts to deteriorate. The sodium can start to absorb moisture from the air. So there are some nice examples of that in the study gallery here in the museum, of glass that has started to deteriorate because the ingredients, there wasn't exactly boron oxide in it. So you melt your ingredients together in a big pot, that's called a crucible. This all happens in an industrial setting. It's a manufacturing process that happens in a factory under very controlled conditions. And when those ingredients melt and flow together, that's how they become glass. You can picture it kind of like a big pot of syrup. And when the glass originally becomes glass, it is in its molten state. And remember I said glass is pretty stretchy when it's hot. You can see me stretching out parts as I'm attaching them. When it's at its melting temperature, it's very stretchy, and so if you take portions of the glass out of the crucible and stretch them and let them cool, you end up making a glass rod. And so that's my starting point when I'm sculpting glass, is the glass rod. And so if you take those ingredients, silica, soda ash, limestone, and boron, and you make glass, you're going to have borosilicate glass, and that's going to be this lovely, clear, bright glass that I'm using for the handles. And if you want some white borosilicate, you might also add some tin or zinc oxide. Oxides are basically rust, but you get different oxides from different metals. And when you add those to the formulas and melt them in, they will affect the other ingredients. They'll interact with the other ingredients, and that's what creates the color. So different ingredients in the formula to create different colors of glass. Now, that means that since each color of glass has its own chemical formula, each color of glass has the potential to behave a little bit differently when you melt it. You can see the red starting to show up now. And so some colors flow nice and smoothly when you melt them. Some of them are sort of gummy or stringy when you melt them. And so you have to be responsive to the glass. You have to watch what it's doing and interact with it to get the results that you want. And so different colors need sometimes different kinds of attention. Can you say that louder? The glass tubes can come in different colors, absolutely right. So yeah, in this case, I'm starting with a piece of white tubing. This is a piece of clear glass tubing, and yeah, you can get rods of glass or tubes of glass in lots of different colors. So to bring that around to the issue of the red and why the color disappeared, there's one sort of interesting and peculiar family of colors that we call striking colors. And in glass terminology, to strike means that the color appears. It does that at a particular temperature. It's called the striking temperature, and that's specific to the formula of the glass. And at the melting temperature, the color disappears. And of course, in this process, I'm melting and remelting parts of the glass, sometimes numerous times as I'm working. And so when I'm working with a striking color, and the red is a striking color, I put it in place where I know I want it to be, and then I ignore it because I know that the color is going to sometimes appear and sometimes disappear. So right now, you can see an orange glow around the mushroom cap, but it's no longer red because I just melted it again to reshape it. And it will turn red again in a little while. So striking colors are really interesting. Striking doesn't serve any purpose in glass making. It just has to do with the chemical formula of some colors. But it's kind of interesting to see because it ends up looking kind of like a magic trick. Okay, we got the mushroom cap. I'm going to put some white spots on there. I think if I can find... There it is, the white glass that I want. This is a different white. It's an opaque white, and I want to put some really bright white dots on the cap. But first, what I want to do is let that mushroom cap firm up a little bit. And so, when I am waiting for one part to cool, I'll work on another part. So we're going to add a little nose. Some eyes. This is another striking color, so although the rod looks like it has no color, it is going to have a sort of golden color to it. This colored glass that I'm using is called amber purple. Working on the tiny details like the nose and the eyes, perfect recipe for me to forget to flash, because I'm going to a smaller flame and really focusing on getting the details in place. And so this is prime opportunity for me to accidentally break the glass. So I'll try not to do that. And so the amber purple, just like the red, when I melt it and apply it, is gonna be colorless. You can't really see those eyes yet, but as they go through their striking temperature range, they're gonna become a kind of gold color. And then I'm gonna put some black dots on there for the pupils as well. Oh, did you say I was cleaning the end of the rod off? Is that what you're asking about why? Yeah, I do. I pick the end of the glass rod off so instinctively that I hardly realize that I'm doing it. But I do that a lot because when you first heat the end of a glass rod, sometimes it will bubble a little bit, and especially if I'm putting down a little dot, a very small dot of color. I'm going to be doing that with this black glass. I don't want any bubbles in there because it will not melt in and make a nice clean spot. It'll make a kind of wobbly lump instead. And so whenever I'm heating up the end of the glass rod, if I see any bubbling, I'm going to just pick that off so that I get down to some glass that's a little, that's flowing more smoothly, and that way I can manage it better. Once in a while, I might also be reshaping the end of a rod, because sometimes I'm, like for this black, I need there to be a little taper on the end because I'm trying to reach in there and put a tiny little black dot in place. It's kind of like sharpening your pencil when you want to draw a thin line. Now you can see the eyes glowing. That's the black color that's glowing like that. And then we're going to soften those up and flatten them in a little bit. All that heat of applying the eyes and the nose started the bubble to collapse just a little bit. That's why I still need the tube to be attached to it, because if it collapses, if it flattens out or starts to sink in, I need to be able to puff some air back in there and plump it up again. All right, we got a little face. I'm gonna just make a little indentation for the mouth here. And then we'll go to the dots for the top of the hat. So remember I said that the jade white is a translucent glass. This one, although it's a striking color, so although it looks clear in my hand right here, it is actually going to strike to a very opaque white. And so it makes a really nice, crisp, kind of graphic effect on the surface of the mushroom cap. And we're going to melt those dots in. Again, when the top of that mushroom cap gets hot enough, when it's very soft, it will start to want to flatten out. So I have to sort of create a balance of getting that hot enough that the white dots start to sink into the surface, and then give it a little puff of air to round it out some more. And then we're going to go in and just gently flatten those a bit as well. always thinking about the softness or hardness of any particular part as I'm working. Yeah. Yep. If I want to make something larger, when do I need help with that from an assistant? That's an interesting question. I think that's when you become a furnace glass blower. I think that's really interesting. I had never thought about that because I always work alone. I never have worked with an assistant, but I have seen a demonstration where a flame worker was working with an assistant, and that particular flame worker was doing really complicated, delicate color work and had an assistant who was preparing the colored glass rods. So I guess you could work with an assistant. And for me, I'm sort of skirting the question because I don't think I know the answer to it. But for me, when I want to make something larger, I'm more likely to think about how to make small parts and combine them, in which case I'm still going to do that by myself. And that's sort of just because of my creative process and my personality. I like to work single-handed. But you certainly will see when people work at the furnace and blow glass, they often are working with an assistant or sometimes more than one assistant because the equipment is bigger and the space that they need to work in is bigger, and so it's beneficial to have extra hands. Speaking of hands, I'm just shaping the mushroom's little paws here. There's all kinds of potential for me to make really complicated hands with tiny little fingers in this process, and probably down the line I'll be making some mushrooms that have hands with fingers because that gives you a lot of opportunity to sort of create an active feel in the character. But for this demo, we're just going to give him little mittens. So we'll add some thumbs. Okay, we are almost done with this guy. I'll show you right here where there's an area where the red is not showing up yet because that was just recently very, very hot. But the red is showing up pretty nice and neatly around the rest of it. And eventually that red is going to start to show up as well. So we've got him attached to a tube. I need to take that off. It's a nice firm attachment because I didn't want it to break off while I was working with it. And that is called a hot seal. You got two types of connections when you're working with glass. One is a hot seal, and that means you heat both surfaces that you're joining until they flow together. All the parts of our mushroom character are hot sealed in place because I want them to stay attached. And I needed that tube to be very sturdy while I was working with it, so I hot sealed that in place too. And what that means is that in order to remove it, I have to melt it off. I'm going to inflate and pop a little hole in it. And then I'm going to kind of then I'm going to tear that off of there after I put this handle back on the top. So hot seals are permanent, and in order to remove them, you have to melt them. But then there's something called a cold seal. That's what this is. The cold seal is where you just heat the glass up enough to make it sticky. And if you stick two bits together that are not flowing, it's very fragile. And so you really have to be careful to avoid any accidental cold seals in your sculpture. But the cold seal is useful for a temporary attachment. All right, so we got a little opening here, I hope. There it is. And a little bit of extra clear glass that needs to come off of there. Now, the reason I need a hole here is that this whole object is quite hot now, right? And that means although the glass is firm, it's still over 1,000 degrees, and that means the air inside of the mushroom is expanded because it's so hot. If you seal up a very hot piece of glass, it creates a vacuum situation inside there, which means that if it were to break, it could be a little bit more dynamic of a breakage than you might want it to be. It might be a little bit, it might, sort of pop. And so you don't really want to seal up a piece of glass when it's hot. And so I'm going to leave this little opening there where the handle was attached. And so I'm just cleaning off the excess clear glass, and then we'll kind of pat that in so it's smoother. But that's why when I was looking at it, I said, oh, I hope it's open still, because I don't want it to seal up. If you accidentally seal up your hot glass and then you melt part of it, it sucks the soft glass in. It will make a big dent in your glass because the vacuum is pulling that soft glass in. Okay, we're going to double check and make sure that this mushroom can balance, and it looks like it does. And then we're going to take the handle off the top. And in order to when I take it off, I'm going to have to smooth out that spot where it's attached. And so before I take it off, I'm going to put another handle on there. There's some steps of the process that seem like, wait, didn't you just do that already? But you back and forth. I might have figured out a more efficient way to do this last step of removing it from its tubing. But so far, I haven't figured that out. So that's an interesting reason for doing things over again. Okay, so now when I take the handle off the bottom, it will make a rough spot too, but it won't be as important to get it perfectly smooth because it's just going to be on the bottom. So smoothing that out, and then there is our little whimsical mushroom character. So thank you very much for watching. Thank you. Thank you. Now you might notice that the top of the mushroom cap has lost its red color again because I was just melting it to smooth it out on top. If you want to go bigger, at what point do you need an assistant? And let me show you this, because this is an example of something where I was thinking about how big can I go with this idea, and the way that I might go bigger. This mushroom is a little bit bigger, but also would be to attach other parts to it. And so if you can see right there, there's a sort of, extra bit of glass coming off of the foot, and I've attached some clear glass, sort of blended it in with the white, because what I know is that I can hold this in my hand at room temperature, and if I have a setup like this with also a little bit of glass sticking off of it, and I use a really tiny flame, that I could then very carefully melt those and join them and assemble that into a larger sculpture. And when I make larger sculptures, that's what I do, is I start with small parts. You can see each one of these, the flower, the cat, the bird, the leaves, those are all little simple elements that I can make just like I made the mushroom, but then gradually I can start assembling them into a larger structure, and I'll turn that around to the back so you can see what's holding this all together is a sort of architectural tree shape that I could, carefully attach those parts to. So this is a larger piece of sculpture, but still made modularly, one bit at a time. I think if you were a furnace worker, you might, instead of solving it that way, you might solve it by having an assistant, right? Because you could sit and have somebody bring you all those parts as you were making the attachments. But in the flame working process, I typically think about it as a gradual, accumulation of parts that allows me to get to a larger structure. Here's another example of that same kind of structure where I've got, the little figurine, the grapes, the flowers, all made at different points in time, the sort of central stem here, and then gradually putting all those together to make a larger structure. So when I'm assembling glass to make a larger structure, I'm thinking about a sort of tree shape where I can attach parts to the base. But when I am thinking about making a mixed media, larger sculpture, then I have other kinds of possibilities. So again, I think I talked a little bit earlier about the box structure. So here is a wooden box that gives me flat surfaces that I can put drawing on, and then you can sort of see that these glass elements all have a kind of stem shape, like a goblet might, and those stems, set down into the block of wood and allow the glass to be supported. And so that's an opportunity for me to go as large as I might want, but still have the glass elements themselves be more simple, more something that I can make one at a time and finish in a shorter session than if I was going to try to make a really gigantic sculpture where I needed everything to be hot the whole time. And so there are lots of reasons why I like to assemble things, and most of it just is my personal taste, because there's lots of flame workers who might make things that are much bigger in lots of different kinds of ways, and they might work with partners as they're doing that. Okay, so I think I showed you everything. Oh, this is the one more little group of things here that I've been working on this summer. And when I first agreed to do this demo, my original thought, because this was way back in the spring, my original thought was that I was going to be making some little flower fairies, because that was the design that I was working on at the time. And so this is an example of that. You can see same kind of sort of tree-like structure of parts that are assembled onto various points, and then it has a base that holds everything up. And this is, again, it's made very similarly to the mushroom, where this part is hollow, the head and the leaves and the arms are solid, and there's lots of delicate detail. And what I realized about this piece is that it's really, really slow. It would take a few hours to make this, and it wouldn't fit very well into a demo. But it's the kind of thing that I like to make, and so that's one of the reasons I brought all these things, so that you can see where this same process can go if you're spending more time on it. And so I've got a bunch of examples of little fairies and flowers and sort of flower spirit characters in there as well. So I think that's pretty much everything that I have to show and tell. You are all welcome to come right down here and have a close look if you like. And if you have any questions, please let me know, because I'd be very happy to answer them for you. All right, well, thank you very much. Thanks so much for being here. It's so much my pleasure to be able to show you all this, and have a great afternoon. Thanks a lot for coming. Sorry, couldn't hear you. You bet. Questions, I'm happy to answer.
When you're creating your characters, do you start them as a drawn concept, or is it just an idea? And how playful can you get when you are working with just with glass?
Oh, I love that question. So how do I start with the design ideas, and how much can I play with them and adjust as I'm working? I didn't bring, but I sort of meant to bring, but didn't bring sketches, because yes, I draw a lot. And when I'm